Hi there, have you ever wanted a particular size of jump ring that you just can't find? Whether you're making chainmail or just want a few jump rings for links and clasps, I've got two methods of making the jump rings you want. And if you want to see more techniques and tutorials like this one, hit that subscribe button. Now let's get making. I tend to make all of my jump rings, as it gives me control over the size, the diameter, the type of wire they're made from, and the quantity. And these methods result in flush ends of the wire, rather than a pinched end you often get with bought jump rings. Both of the methods I'm showing here cut the jump rings by hand. You can get equipment to mechanise the process, but I haven't yet justified the cost. To make the jump rings, you're going to need some wire, and the limit to the gauge you use is really about how hard the wire is. It needs to hold its shape. So I've made jump rings out of 0.8mm diameter, which is 20 gauge wire. But in my bare copper, that's quite soft. So I tend to only go down to 0.9mm diameter or 19 gauge. And generally I'll reach for the 1mm diameter or 18 gauge wire for most uses. For larger jump rings, say 10mm internal diameter and larger, you might want to increase the wire thickness too. So you could go up to 1.25mm diameter or 16 gauge, or possibly even thicker than that. I've called this the jump ring pliers method, as it uses these jump ring coil cutting pliers. And I'll drop links to all the tools I'm using in the description below. In addition, you'll need a jeweller's saw and blade, and some lubricant for that. I just use beeswax. And then the mandrel to coil the wire on. And I've got a selection here. These are the gizmo mandrels, and the crank handles make it easy to make the coil. This is the deluxe set, which comes with this clamp, and I'll show you how to use that in a moment. And this is the Beadalon jump ring maker. This one comes with mandrels that are 4, 6, 7 and 8mm, and they just screw into this plastic handle to help you make the coil. Or if you want to improvise, you might have something like a knitting needle in the right size. As long as it's straight, a consistent width, and will hold its rigidity, you could experiment with whatever you have to hand. So the first thing to do is to make a coil. And I'll pick the largest mandrel of the gizmo, which is 5.2mm in diameter. I'm going to use my 1mm diameter or 18 gauge wire. I'll take it around the back of the handle and then just attach it down that vertical part of the handle. And make sure the end isn't anywhere that it's going to catch. And then the wire will be coming over the mandrel to create the coil. So then I can put the end of the mandrel into the holder and the clamp that comes with it. And just rotate that handle to create the coil. Keep a bit of tension on the wire to keep it straight, and the coil will build at the side of the clamp. And you can just keep going to create the length of coil that you want. Once you've got that, let the handle go and it'll spin back a little bit just because of the tension of the wire. Then you can cut off the coil, undo the wire from the handle and slide the coil off. And then you can trim that end. And you've got a coil ready for cutting. If you're using something like a knitting needle, obviously you haven't got the crank handle, but making the coil is still fairly easy to do. Wind your wire around the knitting needle and just leave a little bit of a tail on the wire. Then you can use that to keep tension on the wire. And I like to turn the knitting needle to create the coil. It will be a bit slower than the gizmo, but it is better to take it slowly and try to keep those coils right next to each other without any gaps. That'll help when it comes to cutting later. Once you've got the length of coil you want, you can slide it off the knitting needle and trim the wire. And then that coil's ready for cutting. So let's take a look at the jump ring coil cutting pliers. From the top we can see there's a slot in either side for the saw to move down. And if we open them up, on one side there's a pin for the coil to sit on. This can also be used to rest the pliers on a surface. But the length between the top of the pin and the top of the pliers is really the maximum length of the coil we can cut. So if I pop in this coil we made on the gizmo, you can see it extends way above the top of the pliers. So there's no support for cutting the jump rings there, and they're likely to deform out of shape when you try to cut them. So I'll cut that coil in half, and then it'll fit nicely into the pliers. Now normally for sawing, the blade's set up to cut on the downward stroke. But if we're right-handed, that puts the downward pressure on the side of the pliers that doesn't have the pin. So I often find the force of the saw ends up skewing the jump rings, and it makes it impossible to cut them. But if we cut from the other side of the pliers, the force is pulling the coil apart, and again this tends to skew the jump rings. So I've found I can cut the coil best if I turn the saw blade around. It's then cutting on the upward stroke, and the pressure is heading down to that pin. This keeps the coil in place, and I found it the easiest way to cut all the jump rings. If you're left-handed, however, the downward stroke will be heading towards that pin automatically, so you don't need to change the saw blade around. And incidentally, I'm cutting this on one of my old bead mats with a bit of cardboard underneath just to protect the work surface. So I just lubricate the blade with some beeswax. And it's also worth having an awl to hand. I'll show you why in a moment. So we'll pop the coil in, and then we can start sawing. And you just need to saw down one side, but you need to be careful that you don't hit the other side of the jump rings with the saw blade. So when it looks like you're getting close, take the saw blade out. Some of the jump rings might come out with it, and any others you can just use that awl to furt out. And just keep cutting down to the end of the coil to make your jump rings. I've used this method for a number of years without any problems. The one limit I've noticed is the size of jump ring. As you increase the size of that coil, the pliers hold it less well, and it tends to tilt and make cutting impossible. So I'd say 10mm is about the maximum diameter I'd cut with this method. This is more of a traditional method, and we're replacing the pliers and mandrels with these, wooden dowels. We're using these to make the coil and support the cutting. So other than these, you only need a saw and a clamp or bench peg. You can get lengths of dowel in the hardware store. I found these in the moulding section. I've cut a piece off my dowel, as these came in 90cm lengths, so it was a bit unwieldy. The smallest diameter I could find there though was 6mm, so you might need to head to a craft store for something smaller. They're used quite a lot in model making. I'll also pop an Amazon link in the description below if you want to take a look there. So I'm going to make the coil on the mandrel in the same way as I did with the knitting needle. I'll keep a tail of wire to help with the tension. Make sure that first coil's quite tight. And then rotate the dowel. And I'm trying to keep those coils right next to each other without any spaces. I can make this coil as long as I want to. for the number of jump rings that I want. I think that's long enough. So I can cut the coil from the wire. And then I'll slide that coil up to the end of the dowel. Now, if you're using a bench peg, I suggest holding the dowel like this, and then you're sawing from the end. This helps hold the coil in place on the dowel, and you can use your thumb along the side of the coil. But I prefer using the clamp, as it'll completely hold the dowel steady for you. And I like to position it so the end of the coil is resting on the edge of the clamp. This just provides a bit of extra help to stop it sliding backwards. Then I'll lubricate my saw. And I'll start sawing through the dowel and the jump rings. And I can keep my thumb to the side of the jump rings to help. It can be a little bit difficult to get it started. And just be careful to keep your saw at an angle so that you're not cutting through the bottom of the jump rings. If you're getting close to that, you can either take them off whilst the saw's in the dowel, or back the saw right out, and then you can slide them off the dowel. I'll just take those off the saw as they'll probably drop and I'll lose them on the floor. And then I can finish cutting my coil. Because this method supports the jump rings from the inside, this is the easier method for larger jump rings. And I think potentially there's less wire waste too. And there you have your finished jump rings. Along with the jump rings we made using the pliers earlier. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, hit that like button below. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel and head over to my website for more hints, tips and projects. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.